Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is the seventh in a series of lectures on MacIntyre's dependent rational animals, and we are looking particularly at chapter 7 of this text here, which deals with vulnerability, flourishing, goods, and good. So a lot of concepts there, but we're going to try to pay attention to them carefully and how they relate to each other within the context of thinking about flourishing as human animals. So we begin this discussion with some distinctions that MacIntyre relies on but does not go into some detail. And I just want to spend a little tiny bit of time on these common words, and I apologize if this is redundant to many people. So we can talk about terms as univocal, equivocal, or analogical in their meanings. So a term has a univocal meaning if it is used in the same sense every time. So, for example, entomology is the study of insects. It does not have any other meaning than that. For MacIntyre, the concepts flourishing and needs are univocal. They mean the same thing every time. And so one of the things that we're going to look at here is what that definition of flourishing is for MacIntyre and how that is univocal, even though it applies to different species. And the same thing with the concept of needs. Some terms are equivocal, and so this is where a term has more than one meaning. So moon could be used as a name for Earth's moon, or it could just be used to talk about other moons around other planets, right? So in this case, moon has an equivocal meaning because it can be used in more than one way. Flourishing does not, right? It's univocal. It can only be used in one way according to MacIntyre. And finally, there are analogical terms. And here, obviously, it's not univocal and it's not equivocal, but it's something in between the two. In parts, it's univocal, and in parts, it's equivocal because it's an analogy. So MacIntyre uses the common example of healthy me versus healthy food, right? So when I use the term healthy to talk about myself, I mean something that is similar to, but not equivocal to, right? I'm sorry, similar to, but not equivocal from healthy food, right? Healthy means something analogically the same in both cases. So it's neither univocal or equivocal. For MacIntyre, the concept of reason is an analogical term. So in the first 6 lectures, we have talked about language and pre-linguistic reasoning and beliefs like that. So the concept of reason is not going to be equivocal between the way that human animals and non-human animals reason, but it's also not going to be univocal. It's going to be analogical because there are going to be shared characteristics in the ways that human animals and non-human animals reason, right? And that obviously is going to be tied to the concepts of flourishing and needs. So one of the things that we recognize about the non-human animal world is that non-human animals are vulnerable in many ways. And of course, we've been spending a lot of time talking about dolphins, and dolphins are vulnerable in many ways. And so I concluded the last lecture talking about our friendly, lonely dolphin off the coast of Ireland, which everyone thinks he has passed away. The dolphins live, I believe, 30 years. So it could be because he's old, or it could be for some other reason, right? And so the reason that vulnerability is important is because for dolphins, their chances of surviving and flourishing are remarkably enhanced by their social relationships and group membership. Now, obviously, if you've been paying attention this whole time, what we're going to look at is the way that human flourishing and human surviving is remarkably enhanced by social relationships and group membership. So that part of our flourishing, just as part of dolphins' flourishing, is going to be going to require those social relationships and group memberships in an inherent way, right? It's not something that's accidental. This is part of our nature, right? And so that brings us to this concept of flourishing, right? Flourishing, of course, involves the goods of certain activities as objects of desire, right? Dolphins swim and fly out of the water, or they chase tuna or mackerel or whatever it is that they eat, right? Because those things are objects of desire, and so they're constitutive of well-being, right? If we came across a dolphin and it didn't jump out of the water like we see in this picture here, right, then we would think that there was something wrong with it. Maybe it was sick or something, right? The same thing we're going to say with human animals, right? That our goods are the goods of activities that are objects of desire, right? So we might swim, not because we're dolphins, but because we enjoy swimming and we have a desire to exercise that capacity. We walk because, like dolphins, many of us walk, of course, not all of us, but because, like dolphins, we have a desire to walk, and that's constitutive of our well-being. That doesn't mean that someone who cannot walk can't have well-being. It just means that they're missing one aspect that goes into many other experiences of well-being. Right? So we want to pay attention to those kinds of disabilities as we go forward, whether it has to do with physical disabilities or mental disabilities or psychological disabilities. Flourishing then is univocal because it means to develop the distinctive powers that that one possesses qua member of the particular species one belongs to. So it's univocal because it's the same thing for every species, right? To develop the specific powers of that species. So one of the things that we're going to learn is that for human animals, one of our distinctive powers, and perhaps the most important distinctive, well, certainly for McIntyre, the most important distinctive power is our capacity for linguistic reasoning, for practical rationality. And that is a capacity that dolphins do not have, although they do have pre-linguistic capacities. So need then becomes what is necessary or required for flourishing as that species, right? And that's going to depend on time and environment and context, right? So what our needs are going to be different, right? What the food that I need is going to be different given how old I am and what my capacity for eating is and all those sorts of things, what environment I'm in, whether I'm overweight or not overweight or exercising or all these sorts of things, right? These are, importantly for McIntyre, factual matters, right? The Aristotelian and the Thomists believe that flourishing can be determined as a factual matter, what is required for flourishing. And that's true in the dolphin case as well as the human case. So good then, we're turning to this new concept, has three senses, right? There's a utilitarian sense, something is good if it has some use to me. And the classic example here, of course, is money. Money is good for us in the 20th century. It would not be so good for those in the 1st century BC because they didn't have a lot of it and it didn't do a lot for people, right? But for us, it's necessary, but it's a utilitarian good, and people could live without money in different cultures and different societies, etc. Then we also talk about goods that are internal to practices, right? The goods of a member of a fishing crew are the goods of being able to make a pass in basketball, which could be very different than the good of being able to make a pass in soccer, right? So you would use different limbs to make the pass and different parts of the body to make the pass, and the kind of pass that you would make and the way that it plays out in basketball versus soccer are going to be different. But those goods are not utilitarian, right? It's not like having money, but they are limited to the kinds of practices that they belong in. And that is something that McIntyre spells out much more carefully in his book After Virtue, and is something that he expects the person to kind of know in reading this book. If you want to learn more about those kinds of goods, I do have a video on goods and on practices on my YouTube channel. And then there's finally the good that is the good of human beings as human beings. And so this is something that is typically good in itself, but also good for our human flourishing, not in a utilitarian sense, but in a constitutive sense. And so reason is going to be one of those goods, right? The capacity for reason is constitutive of our human flourishing, and it is also a good in itself, right? It's not simply something utilitarian. Now, as human beings who have particular goods and particular kinds of capacity for flourishing, we also have vulnerabilities. And this is a theme that McIntyre has been emphasizing throughout his book, right? And so now we're starting to think about, well, what are those vulnerabilities? And we've paid attention to some of those vulnerabilities earlier in terms of linguistic capacity, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're turning to the kinds of vulnerabilities we have that relate to our specific capacity for practical reasoning and for language. Okay. And so these goods are not only bodily, right? So we do have vulnerabilities to our body that limit our capacity for reasoning and for our capacity for language, but we also have other kinds of vulnerabilities, right? And so if our immediate bodily needs are not satisfied, right, early on particularly, but even on an every day-to-day basis, then we can suffer physical, emotional, psychological, and mental harm. And so you probably read many times about people who don't get enough sleep and they have an intellectual disability the next day, right? And it might be temporary, but it's still a vulnerability that they have. And so we can also distinguish different kinds of goods and the wider range of goods that are necessary for flourishing, both for humans and dolphins. And so one of those goods for humans and dolphins is to learn to separate themselves, for humans, but not for dolphins, is to learn to separate themselves from their immediate desires, right? And so you've probably seen these kinds of charts before, eat this, not that. And what we have to do there is learn to separate ourselves from our immediate desires. And of course, what McIntyre is going to bring up later on is that this is something that is inimical to the consumerist capitalist society that we live in. They want you to not separate yourself from your immediate desires because that means you're going to spend less and you're going to buy important things when you do buy something rather than things that are not necessary. Okay. Second, we must be able to explain why I acted in the way that I did in these circumstances, right? Because part of what I'm doing is I have to make an account of myself to others, okay? But also I have to justify my own actions so that I know that I am headed towards flourishing, okay? And the liberation here is not always necessary. It can be inhibiting. And you can think about Ross from Friends, the TV show Friends, where he's always deliberating, always questioning himself, and he never actually gets anything done. And so it inhibits him from flourishing in many ways. Okay. But what is necessary for the human being to flourish is the possibility of raising questions about his or her own actions. Why did I do this rather than that? Why am I always choosing the plain bagel rather than the carrots and the healthy dip there? So part of what we have to experience, and one of the ways that we are vulnerable, is in transitioning to becoming independent practical reasoning, right? So we have to go from having to evaluate our reasons, which we learned early on as children if we grow up in a healthy household, right, to transforming our desires and passions. And I think one of the vulnerabilities that we see here is in the series Seinfeld. They simply lack this ability to transform their desires and passions. And we see that over the 9-episode series, so that when they are in jail in the last episode, they're actually talking about the same thing that they talked about in the first episode, right? Where does the button go on a shirt, right? And so we have to be wary of the kinds of things that we might be vulnerable to that prevent that transformation of desires and passions, right? And so that might be where others do not provide the resources that we need, or where we fall victim to disabling conditions, or where we fail to learn cooperation. All of those things are needed, right, to become independent practical reasoners, okay? But another thing that's needed is an awareness informed by an imagined future, right? What is it possible for me to do? It might not be possible for me today to, say, stop smoking or to eat less, but it might be possible for me to train myself not to smoke anymore, or to train myself to eat carrots rather than bagels, right? And so those who are deficient in imagination are vulnerable to not becoming independent practical reasoners, or they're constrained by their childhood, or they have a poor education. Now, this is a single process, right? And I think we see that in the character of Harry Potter over the 7-book arc, where he transforms from being a dependent person to someone who becomes an impractical reasoner so that he is able to step away from his desires at the end, which is to live, and allow himself to be sacrificed, trusting in Dumbledore that when Voldemort kills him, something good will come from that, right? And so that is the kind of transition that we need to look for in our everyday lives.